Right, good afternoon. My name's Rory and I'm going to talk to you a bit about animation. I'm going to talk about how it works and about the various techniques that have been developed over time, so a little bit of the history and story, and then hopefully I'll show you a bit about how you might want to make one yourself. So, lesson one. If you observe, it's a bit difficult because it doesn't really work with film, but anyway, this is the principle. Okay. Now you will have noticed, unfortunately you probably haven't noticed, that the red dot has turned into a continuous blur, but you've certainly seen that the fan has. This is a phenomenon called the persistence of vision. No one's quite sure how it works, but it's to do with how the brain adjusts to all the information that it's receiving from your eyes to make it into a reasonable picture that you can follow. Okay. A chap called Roget, who you might have heard of because he also wrote Roget's Thesaurus, book of antonyms and synonyms. In 1824 he figured out that if a light makes that circle 10 times a second, it will appear as a continuous line. And that principle was initially taken up by a lot of toy makers during the 1840s and then on, and this is one of them, the zoetrope. They all worked with the same sort of principle. If you put your eye in one place and looked through, as it were, one slot in a circle that was continuously spinning, then you could put drawings on the inside of that spinning cylinder, and as each drawing overlapped the last one, it would look as if the drawing was moving. This is the principle upon which film is based, and that's it. As you can see, the Victorians had a very strange sense of humour. I always hoped that Magritte might have seen this one. It looks so like one of his paintings. Now, around about the 1880s, they developed a material called celluloid, which is a thin plastic, a transparent plastic, and from that evolved the idea of photographic development, which had previously been always on glass. Now they developed photographs onto celluloid, and then a chap called Eastman developed, with working for Edison, developed strip film, so that you could take a succession of individual photographs, one after the other, run those through a projector, and it wouldn't look like film. And very quickly people realized that they could apply the same theory of the zoetrope drawings to continuous film. So instead of only having this little cycle of someone, whatever, hurling a sort of stick over his head, you could make a continuous film. And a chap called Winsor McCay, as a bet actually at his club, made a film doing drawings on these enormous sheets of paper, I have to say, fantastic science drawings. And in this case he had to do every single one of these drawings over and over and over again. And I'll explain why I said that, because at a later time the other techniques came into being. So here is Winsor McCay. As you can see, this rather sweet little story. There's no logic to it at all. You can see what I mean about this being done each frame drawn completely afresh. The way the colours are flashing like that, because he's using watercolour on paper and he can't keep it even. Around about the same time as Winsor McCay was doing his drawings, a chap called Vladislav Stalovich was working in Russia and in Paris. In 1912 he made a film using insects with wire inserted to make legs, and he turned them into sort of little creatures and told a story. And here it is. It's called Cameraman's Revenge, and I have no idea what's going on, but enjoy. Another great innovator at this time was a chap called Georges Méliès. He did most of this live action, but he worked out how he could use the wind back technique. Basically, if you expose a film to light, as you know, it then develops into a negative. Now, if you can black out part of the film, then what you do is you wind the camera back, then you cover the stuff you filmed the first time, and you shoot the second lot of stuff the second time round as you go through the animation. It sounds as complicated as it is, but it's the basis of how we put films together in what are called special effects shots, and these are special effects shots. As you can see here, he mixes this, breaks through to a face, and then he makes a jump cut as the rocket reaches the moon. Oops, and it's in his eye. And again there is a jump cut there so that the drawing is transformed to the model and all the actors can come climbing out. Here you can see Méliès trusted the audience doesn't notice things like the rocket suddenly disappearing, so they can move aside, and now here comes this sort of rather theatrical setup, but he's actually doing this using film, removing one set as the Earth rises. In 1933, Starovich, the chap who made the Cameraman's Revenge with the insects, set out to make a much more complicated film, which was called The Mascot. If you tune in next week to my talk on script writing, I'll tell you what the MacGuffin is. But in this film, the MacGuffin is an orange, which the little dog, Toy, has to find for his owner, who's ill. He goes through lots of adventures. What Starovich is doing in this film is to combine animation with live action, as where that hand came in. Sometimes the hand is live and all the animation stops briefly, but sometimes he animates the hand so that he can continue to animate the puppet as there. And again here. Starovich is using a number of techniques here. This is back projection work, so he just has a screen behind his set. Here he's painted and animating the wheel of the car, and then the puppet. And here he's created a mechanical foot which he's animating with. And now he crosses to a live action shot of a policeman. This technique, developed by Starovich, was also used by a chap called O'Brien, working in Hollywood, where he made probably one of the most famous special effects films combining stop-motion animation with live action. It was called King Kong, and he made it in 1932. Starovich made The Mascot in 1933, so they were sort of working towards this idea of the multiple exposure. Here's a bit of King Kong. They use three techniques here, actually. There's the back projection of the jungle behind King Kong. Then there's the animation of the puppet itself. Then there's the man inserted into a scene below, which is built into the model of the set. So it's just a little patch of that was double exposed to put him in there. And then in the close-ups of him inside that cave, they used a big giant hand. They more or less built King Kong as a fully realized animal without his chest and stomach. So they had his legs, they had his arms, they had his head, full size, for different parts of the film. Who took this on later was probably one of the most famous and certainly most revered of the stop-motion animators making this kind of film, Ray Harryhausen, who I had the honour of meeting back in the 1980s. This is one of his films, and he specialised in this multiple exposure, putting animated creatures, in this case the statue of this god, into live action film. This is Jason and the Argonauts, still one of my favourites. Still one of my favourites. Again, Harryhausen uses a variety of techniques. That was a real set. Now he's got a machine pumping water, but the animated model superimposed in front of it. And this is the animation. So he was using a material called latex. It's a kind of rubber, and you get latex gloves. So this model is actually made out of rubber on a metal skeleton that he articulates. You see how he puts the smoke around him so that he can blend him into the background. Now that's a very specific area of animation work, working into live action, and I admit that this is because that's where I made most of my living. If you want to know who I am, I was the two spiders that jumped on Harry Potter's car in the Chamber of Secrets, and a number of other films. Hellbound is another award winner. But of course, at the same time, there was people just developing animation for its own sake. Walt Disney, we've all heard of. And later on other Americans, Chuck Jones and people like that, and there's a whole area which would be too much to cover now. Meanwhile, more interestingly from our point of view, because we're going to talk about making your own films, people in Europe were working with what's called stop motion. We saw it with the insects at the beginning, and that is a very easy technique to work with, and we'll get to that. But here, for instance, is a film, part of a film by a Polish man called Trinka. It was a film he made under the communists as a political protest, and it got him into a lot of trouble, but he managed to keep it subtle enough to eventually survive that regime. It's called The Hand. As you can see, he too is using live human hand. Not quite sure about this business of the black and grey gloves, but obviously it has some significance. In this case, the hand is being animated in all these shots. Of course, you could say that the symbolism in this film is fairly banal, but first of all, of course, it was fresher then. This is a film made in the 30s, I think. So the symbolism seems a little obvious, it's just that we've become more sophisticated with the way that we interpret film as an audience. I love this piece of carving. If only it was that easy. Then there's this chap, Jan Schwankmajer. He was a Czech filmmaker, although he also worked in Poland. In fact, he worked at the same studio as Trinker. He specialized in very surreal ideas. This one that I'm going to show you, which I like, is probably one of his more straightforward films, really. It's called Conversations. This is one of the conversations that he illustrates with his animation. This looks, by the way, as if he's spreading lard on that bread, but that is Polish butter. I think here he may be combining live action, the way the toothpaste moves, with his animation. Something you learn early in film is that any trick you want to use is viable if it works. Well, he goes on in this way, I must say, for quite a lot longer, making his point very clear. And but anyway, as you can see, he's prepared to play with all sorts of elements. And there are other films of his you can look him up. Now, this next two films are by one of my great heroes, and I have to say one of the great heroes of animation. He was working in Canada in the 1920s and 30s and on, and he worked here and worked most of the time with his partner, and they lived together for years. I can't think of his name, Grant Munro. This is a film they shot over one weekend, two films over one weekend, just animating Grant. If you think he's shooting 1 or 2 frames at a time, it means that Grant has to move a little bit and then reassume the position that he had before. So what he has to have is what is called body memory. He remembers exactly where every part of his body was and is able to repeat that position on and on and on. But once you get hold of the idea of this, it's called pixelation sometimes, of working just with human beings. It's a very quick way to make amusing little films. McLaren used to talk about animation as a form of music. He did again, it's someone that you should look up. There's a lot of his work online, and he experimented with all sorts of techniques. So the last experimental animator I'd like to show you is a chap called Blue. I came across him online. I don't know who he is exactly. There seem to be two of them actually. There's a video about them making one of their films. This is a film he made in Berlin, and it's I think one of the most amusing pieces of work I've ever seen. He did it using a mobile phone, and by simply marking his spot he would do his animation, then go back to the spot and take another frame. You'll notice Berlin is extremely lax about people painting on walls. They love graffiti, it's everywhere. So animated graffiti seems a sort of logical extension for the city. This is a nice switch of location. And there's a rather nice interaction now, look. The real world. All of this was carefully storyboarded and prepared on a dope sheet, just as I described before, and then transferred to the walls once he knew what he was going to do. It's one of those extraordinary achievements. You think, gosh, this is amazing, but golly, what a lot of work. Right. Now, just to round this off in the story of animation, I just thought I'd make a quick mention of computers. I spent half my life working with stop motion tabletop stuff, doing models, moving them slowly in front of the camera, all that stuff. And then I spent the other 20 years of my career with computers. It's quite interesting. It was quite odd, really. Everything that's difficult in stop motion, like flying, is easy in computers. Everything that's easy in stop motion, like walking, is terribly difficult in computers. And they had spent ages, years, writing the software until they got it as good as it is now. But the first one was Toy Story, and I thought I'd just show you a bit of that because it reminds me of what we said at the beginning of this about the exoskeletons of insects. And of course, after Toy Story, they did Bugs Life. So in both cases, they were dealing basically with models where they didn't have to think about all of this stuff. I mean, if you remember that clip of King Kong, all his fur flying about, you know. But if you think of the modern King Kong done with computers, directed by Peter Jackson in New Zealand, the fur is perfect. It behaves like hair does, and so on and so forth. This is what computers do. In fact, the only trouble with computers really is knowing how to stop and actually produce the film, because everything you do with a computer can be slightly improved. So we have Toy Story at one end, and then I'll follow that immediately with a very brief shot from one of the Planet of the Apes films that I happen to have a clip from. Where indeed you can see that the fur does not flicker because it behaves like hair. It's the mathematical analysis of how light is converted to film is really what computers are doing all the time when they tell each of the pixels on the screen in front of you what colour to be at what particular moment every 25th of a second. Right, here are these, here's Toy Story, followed by Planet of the Apes.
Mission Control, is the launch pad construction complete? Roger. Rockets now secured to guide wires. Ignition sticks. Countdown will commence momentarily. Stand by.
Let's go.
Hey, Mom! Where are the matches? Oh, wait, here they are. Never mind!
Woody, great. Help me out of this thing. Shh. What? It's okay. Everything's under control.
As we'll demonstrate in a minute. This boy who looks more like a toy than the toys, practically.
Hey, how'd you get out here? Oh, well, you and I can have a cookout later. Houston, do we have permission to launch? Roger, permission granted. You're confirmed at T-minus 10 seconds. And counting. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1!
Reach for the sky.
Huh?
This town ain't big enough for the two of us.
What?
Somebody's poisoned the water hole.
It's busted.
Who you calling busted, Buster? That's right. I'm talking to you, Sid Phillips. We don't like being blown up, Sid. Or smashed, or ripped apart.
We?
That's right. Your toys.
play nice. We did it! We did it!
Yes! The toys! The toys are alive! Nice toys!
What's wrong, Sid? Do you want to play with Sally?
Nice work, fellas. Good job. Coming out of the ground.
And on it goes, the triumph of the toys, revenge of the toys. And here's Planet of the Apes to show you just how far we've come since that first attempt at a feature film with using computers. Well, that's it. It's a very brief history of animation. I thought just for fun I'd give you one quick glimpse into the future. This is a technology which is still in development, but which I heard about some years ago and I expect will be on the market fairly soon. It's called augmented reality. You've probably got some version of it on your phone. You might have played the Pokemon game, but this is a variation on the HMD head-mounted device scheme. I was told by some high-end research scientists back in 2014 that within the next 10 years those big HMDs that you see now would be about the size of a sort of pair of Ray-Ban dark glasses, and imagine that they should have the effect of this little video now.
What if we could go beyond the screen, where your digital world is blended with your real world? Now we can. This is the world with holograms. What will they enable us to do? New ways to visualize our work.
I have an idea for the fuel tank.
New ways to share ideas with each other.
How are things going your end?
I just put the images in OneDrive.
Perfect.
More immersive ways to play. New ways to teach and learn.
So put the new trap in the place of the old one.
Now what?
And tighten here and here.
New ways to collaborate and explore the places we've never been.
Look at this formation. Let's take a closer look.
And new ways to create the things we imagine. Because when you change the way you see the world, you can change the world you see.
Well, of course there are lots and lots of examples of film that I can show you, and indeed I wish I could, but anyway, let's get on to the issue of making your own films. Now this is pretty straightforward. There's only a couple of things you need to know really. First of all, whoops, you need this or the equivalent of. This is a tripod with a perfectly ordinary digital camera. The only thing you have to remember with the camera is to switch off the sleep mode so that it stays on. This is because you don't. What happens is while you're doing your animation on the tabletop, the camera shuts down, you lose your focal distance, you lose your lighting, you lose your zoom, everything. So very annoying, so remember that. Same thing applies, of course. You can do this with a mobile phone, an iPhone or anything like that. You can buy iPhone tripods, which are simply a way of holding the camera absolutely steady. Now, of course, Blue proved to us that you don't have to keep the camera absolutely steady by just getting himself more or less in the right position, but you will find it easier to do this to begin with a tripod and camera. Rule 1, there are 25 frames to a second. Now we established that's on a PAL system, or British, European television system. The Americans run at 30 frames a second, and this is to do with electrical supply. Anyway, 25 is good enough for you and me. Now, as we know, it only takes 10 frames a second to convince you that something is moving. So you can, in animation, actually take 2 frames at a time, and it works perfectly well, unless you want something flying and you've got it suspended on wires. Then you need to shoot it in singles, as we call it. So each frame is a photograph with your camera. And at the end, when you've collected all of these JPEGs, probably from your camera, you find a software online. I am not going to recommend any in particular, but there are plenty of freebie programs that will basically put your JPEGs together in sequence and turn that into a strip of film and give you a film back. So there are, you have to learn how to use that software, but it's not very complicated. You just add the frames in. So the principle is 25 frames a second. A good way to work, first of all, is with a storyboard. This is called a storyboard. And what you do is, in each of these boxes you put a drawing of the scene, so that you make sure that each of your scenes will be consecutive. This is if you're trying to make a story. The second thing that you can use, or should have an equivalent of, is this. It's a dope sheet. It's called that. I have no idea why, actually. Nothing to do with dope as we understand it now, but to do with dope as meaning information, I think, back in the 20s. Give me the dope. So in each one of these lines, you count as one frame, and as you go along with your film, you tick off the frame to make sure that you're taking those frames, and any dialogue or action you write into the various spaces there on the right. And you can then use this to time your shots. This becomes particularly useful if you're doing something more sophisticated, like working to a soundtrack. If you're telling a story, the way with animation is first to record the soundtrack and then do the animation afterwards. Particularly if you're doing lip syncing, but even just so that you allow the sound to control your timing, if you like. So then the next thing really is a tabletop. I'm not quite sure if I can do this, but if I... Whoa! It doesn't seem to like that very much. But there you are. This will do as a tabletop. Now, in principle, if you're animating, the only rule you want to think about is that the animation only works as long as this frame corresponds to the next frame in such a way that there is a certain amount of overlap in the movement. So if I go from there, say, to there, it doesn't animate, it flickers. It just goes pick, and everybody notices that it's moved. So what you have to do to animate it, oops, I can't see how to get this into shot. There it is. You just have to move it just a little bit at a time, like that. And if I took the series of photographs of that, you would be able to observe the movement. Now, an interesting thing that you will notice there about the 25 frames is actually film, as projected in cinemas and such, is 24 frames, which is much more convenient because half of that is 12. So 12 frames, or 12 positions to a second. 12 frames is a half a second. 12 frames is half a second. And this is also a very regular 4/4 beat in pop music. So it's quite easy to set a film, make a film that just corresponds to almost any track you want to play with it. If you stick to the idea that you put all of your action beats on half a frame, like that, every 12 frames you make your beat. So I'll show you a couple of films now that were made by students of mine. The first one by a group of school children, aged 14 to 16, and the second film was made by some young adults. I suppose they were about 20 or something like that. But I have... Anyway, anyone can do this, as you can see. They did this stuff in a day.
See.
So that's it. I hope you've enjoyed this talk on the story of animation and general principles of filmmaking and having fun. I can't think what else I can add for you now. Obviously, it's a pity that this isn't a Q&A situation and you can ask me some questions. Hopefully one day the pandemic will be behind us, and who knows, but I might be able to come and deliver an animation course at your school, or filmmaking or whatever. You live in an extraordinary time. I know these have been difficult days, but filmmaking is ours. This is something that was invented in the 20th century. It's a technique, it's a technology that Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci and who knows who would have been absolutely delighted to have their hands on a good computer and all of this software, or even just a decent digital camera. Well, gosh knows that they'd have been happy enough with a Kodak Brownie. So take advantage. This is something that you can do. It's something you can do at home, and I think that that should be a delight in itself. And the great thing about animation is that you never get it perfect. So you can always do it again and keep trying and keep trying. All right, well, I think that's about it really. I'm coming up to my 45 minutes, so thank you very much, and take care of yourselves, and goodbye.